Welcome back to another episode of Divorce at Altitude. This is Ryan Calamea. This week, we're going to be talking about what happens when children and parents move around from state by state and also internationally. And one of the biggest fears of parents, whether they're in a divorce or after, is kidnapping and abduction. And so we're going to be talking with a guest, Brian Walters. He's the managing partner of his firm. He'll tell you more about his firm in Texas, and he's got his own international background because Brian was a military brat growing up. We've actually had Brian on the podcast before in talking about the UCCJEA, and that's the Uniform Child Custody Enforcement Jurisdiction Act, and somewhat related topics. But before I go on, Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me back on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, looking forward to the conversation. For those that haven't listened to that other episode on, state by state jurisdictional issues on child custody, can you tell us, our listeners, a little bit more about you and your firm in Texas?
Yeah, like you said, I'm a military brat. I'm a child of the Cold War. My dad went into the Marine Corps during Vietnam and stayed and got to live all over the country and the world. I thought it was very fortuitous childhood. Japan, what used to be West Germany, etc. Many in several states, mostly California over the years when I was a kid, and then came back home to Texas, which is where my parents are from, for college and law school, and have practiced there. And my partner Jake Gilbreath and I have. It may be the largest family law and divorce firm in Texas. It's certainly one of the two or three largest. And we have offices in all the big cities. I'm based out of Houston. He's based out of Austin, but we both cover the state as needed. And we deal a lot with this. Texas is a really large state with a very large international and component, and also people moving in and out of the state from other states. So we deal with these issues all the time. They come up very frequently. And you're right. And I'm a parent too, right? I mean, it would be my nightmare if I was concerned or actually had a child of mine get literally kidnapped and taken overseas, or even taken to another state or hidden out or something like that. It's real serious. And there aren't that many of these cases, but the ones that do occur are obviously really serious and deserve our full attention.
Yeah, so let's for listeners, we've referenced the travel and other aspects, and to kind of give a little bit more context of what we're talking about. Brian and I deal with, even though Texas and Colorado have different state laws, there are these uniform and international laws, and so. Brian, if we're dealing with this situation, one of the is listeners to this podcast know, and you have your own podcast, right?
That's correct.
And we'll have links to that in the show notes. People should check it out. But the situation would be, for listeners that have, are familiar with our podcast, we have our hypothetical divorce clients, Eric and Melanie Wolf. So if they go through a divorce in, let's say, Boulder, Colorado, and then like you, Eric has connections to Texas. He's got some, energy, oil background, and so Houston, one of the capital for, that industry. He goes to Houston and relocates there. And what's going to happen, Brian, if Eric just says, "I'm not coming back, Melanie, to Boulder. I'm just going to stay in Houston. I'm not bringing my kids, the kids back. They're better off here in Houston. I'm going to enroll them in a nice Tony private school in Houston." How are you and I going to work together, or what are the options for Melanie in that scenario? Can you maybe kind of walk listeners through that issue?
Yes. So Melanie would need to take action, right? Because if you just kind of sit and let the kids get enrolled in school and stay with dad for a year or two, and then want to do something, the courts are often going to look at you and say, well, you seem to consent to that, right? Even if you complained about it in text or something, but if you just let them do that, then sort of the facts on the ground become reality. So you've got to act, and generally pretty quickly, because school's a good example. But a lot of times, once kids are in the school, the courts are like, well, I don't know if I want to take them out in the middle of the school year, that kind of thing. So she would want to hop on that real quickly. So what she could do, since this divorce and child custody arrangement was originally from Colorado, and she's still in Colorado, she could file an enforcement. I do believe you're the Colorado lawyer, but you confirm it. She could file an enforcement in Colorado, serve him in Texas with those documents, and compel him to have a hearing up in Colorado. And I would assume that the courts up there would move pretty quickly with that, and the courts in Texas would respect that. If he refused to show up to Colorado, and Colorado issued an order that said bring the kids back immediately, Texas would enforce that. You could send that order to Texas. The Texas courts would then act as if it was a Texas order, since it's all 50 states are required to respect each other's laws and kind of help enforce it. The other option would be to file something in Texas, and pursue it there if you were worried that he was not going to delay or not respond to the Colorado things. That would be the other option. So she has a couple of good options, but unfortunately she's going to have to get lawyers involved, and probably in 2 states, to deal with something like this.
I mean, when I get these calls, and as you said, they're very rare. I think it's highly fact specific, right? Where it's going to matter if Eric, if it's just kind of a one off and he's down there for the weekend. I had a situation over the summer where it was very similar, that one of the parents was making kind of moves to register a child, and you're right. You file something in Colorado. There's the Uniform Child Abduction Prevention Act here in Colorado. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but obviously she could call the police. She could call the police in Colorado. They're probably going to say, you need to call someone in Houston. Brian, what's been your experience in terms of seeing what the police, do in those situations? If Melanie says, calls the police and says, my children have been kidnapped.
They're going to say call a family lawyer. It's not a crime, especially for a divorced husband who has the kids. It's not a crime for him to have the kids. It might be a violation of a court order, which at least in Texas can get you thrown in jail, but that's not the police. It's through our court system, and they do it their own way through what we call contempt actions or enforcement actions down here, at least.
Right. And what you were referencing, earlier, and what we had talked about previously about the UCCJEA is Colorado, if it issues a custody order, a parenting plan, is going to be the home state. And that matters for you and me because Colorado then has jurisdiction to modify, to enforce, and we'll get into kind of registering, a custody order under the UCCJEA in Colorado, or I'm sorry, in Texas. But Colorado's, going to be seen as the home state as long as Melanie is continuing to live in Colorado. So if Eric wants to move to Texas, then Colorado's likely going to be the forum that is going to deal with the modification that he is seeking in terms of relocating, to Texas. But that doesn't mean that Texas can't do anything. Where I'll work with someone like you, Brian, in terms of if I'm representing Melanie, and we know that Eric is frequently going to Texas, there might be a reason for us to register the Colorado parenting plan in Texas to have that open case to enforce the terms of the parenting plan. So for listeners that may not understand that, can you maybe walk us through that registration of a foreign, another state, and what the options are for Melanie if she's working with you in Texas for Eric, withholding parenting time?
Sure. So the registration itself is fairly simple. You just basically slap a cover letter on the Colorado order. You go down to the courthouse. I guess it's all electronic these days, and and file that and say, hey, judge, this is the order that's enforced on these kids, and I'm making that known to the court here in Texas. Now, at that point, nothing happens, right? The Texas courts are like, okay, thanks, but we're not going to do anything unless you ask us to. So, but yes, if let's say in that hypothetical, let's say that she didn't want to wait around for a Colorado court to issue an order for him to come back and then have to serve him. Maybe he's going to hide out and be difficult to serve, or maybe she knows in advance he's going to just ignore it, which is not a wise thing to do, but people do that sometimes. So she might just say, look, let's just get an emergency order to turn the kids over to me in Texas, and essentially get an order that does that, but she'd have to register the file first in Texas, or the court order from Colorado in Texas, and then essentially go to the judge and say, look, here's the Colorado order. I'm clearly supposed to have the kids. Here's, correspondence where he's just saying I'm not going to follow that, or I don't care, or whatever, and give me an order that will allow me to get the kids either from the school or just directly from his possession. Or sometimes the courts will say, bring the kids to court, both parents, and then we'll figure out what's really going on. But if she wanted to move very quickly to get physical custody of them, that's actually probably the quickest way is to do it within Texas. And the courts here are real serious about it. I mean, they don't care if somebody's in Texas or not. They want the court's things to be upheld. And really the only defense to that is, from the dad's side in this scenario, would be some kind of abuse allegation of, I can't turn them over because she's going to abuse them, which is, going to be difficult to prove, and may not be true. So.
Yeah, most courts are going to recognize some sort of exception if there's domestic violence or abuse, or the children are in emotional or physical harm, and the people that use that, they better be prepared to really have some strong evidence, in my opinion. And Brian, you and I, before getting on the show, we talked about the most common scenario in terms of these jurisdictional disputes between different states and people. I mean, they're moving around. You and I are doing this over Zoom,
Yep.
or a web-based platform. You're actually in Las Vegas instead of Texas, and we're now seeing these the ability to move all around. So what's going to happen if Colorado has the original divorce, and then Eric moves to Texas with the children, and then Melanie goes to California, where you've got some roots? What happens in that scenario if Eric reaches out to you and says, hey, Brian, I'd like to switch schools, and Melanie and I don't agree, but Colorado has the original jurisdiction. Walk listeners through that modification, which is in contrast to the registration and enforcement.
Right, that's an interesting one, and there's actually a couple of options in that case, which, in theory, there might be lawsuits in all three states, Colorado, Texas, and California, but that's exactly the purpose of the law, is to avoid having that kind of thing. So technically, either one of them could file a modification in Colorado, since it is still the home state, even though nobody's there. I don't think that would happen, and I think that Colorado would quickly kick the case out and say, look, I appreciate the thought, but nobody lives here. It would normally, under that scenario, belong in Texas, because that's where the children are, which is where that's the focus of that of the jurisdiction provisions are related to the kids. Now, if they had been back and forth in the summer between California and Texas, and then schools coming, and now we've got a crisis, then I think you could argue it either way. And I've had those. I've had to, attend or fly to California and other states to, deal with these hearings where the two states are arguing over the kids and where they belong. And I've had, these three state things where nobody lives in the original state. But generally, where the kids have been the most recently, certainly things like where they go to school, where their doctors are, where their friends are, those are the kind of things. And generally, the courts are going to decide very quickly. There's a provision where the judges from the different states basically call each other and say, look, here's what I know, here's what, let's pick a state so these poor folks don't have to hire lawyers in 3 states, right? Let's just do this in one place. But I think in that particular scenario, the case would probably end up in Texas. And again, that's just where the case is, right? That doesn't mean someone's going to win just because they're in their state where they are. The Texas courts, and I'm sure it's true in Colorado, and I'm sure it's true in all 50 states, the judges are going to do what's in the best interest of the children. That's always the legal standard. And so once we've followed where the case is going to be, then the judges are going to apply the same thing. And I think most of the time you get the same result in all 3 states about where the kids will end up. So sometimes it's a bit of I think, a mistake or not a great use of resources to fight about where we're going to litigate this versus paying attention to what's in the best interest of the kids, which is ultimately should win out, assuming everybody has equal quality lawyers and equal funds to prosecute these things.
Yeah, Brian, I mean, you and I, and it's subject for another episode. I think that there are some real differences between how Texas deals with property
Hmm.
or spousal support, alimony. There's some real significant differences between states in terms of financials. And there
Yeah.
are certainly some differences between states in terms of how they view parenting. But I think that the general trend is they're going a little bit closer together in terms of their view and kind of how our cultures view parenting. And it's so judge specific. I'm sure that, in Texas, regardless of parenting, you're going to have one judge that is generally seen as a little bit more kind of pro mom or a little bit mother oriented versus another judge. And so often I'm sure you get those calls, Brian, where people are kind of forum shopping because they really want some jurisdiction on the that's going to be advantageous to them on parenting. But getting back to the kind of core question, in terms of that modification, when people have abandoned that home state, it results in having this argument about where the jurisdiction should be for any sort of modification. And I'd love to be a kind of a fly in the wall in terms of these judges, Colorado judge calling the Texas judge, and maybe talking about the weather and golf, and hey, do you want this case? No, I don't want this case. And I think that really they're going to talk about what the most recent. It really is again highly fact specific. If there's been some sort of custody evaluation in Colorado that was just a year old, then that's going to be different than, hey, I haven't heard anything about this case for 2 or 3 years. They've been in Texas going to school. Really, I think they're going to look for where the evidence is, and that's the teachers, how long the children have been there, and the facts on the ground. Don't you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I've had a number of these, and that's a little different scenario where, let's say the mom has been in Colorado and dad's been with the kids in Texas for, like you said, 2 years. They've been in school down here, and then someone files a modification. In that case, you would have to start the case in Colorado because that's mom's still there, and that's where the case originally was. But then dad would probably move forward in Colorado and say, "Hey, Colorado, please give up this case, decline jurisdiction." And that's sort of the 2 to 3 year mark. I think you really hit it on the head. Is kind of where judges, when the kids have been out of state that long, and one parent still in the original state, I think that's where the judges start to say, and it's not it's about evidence, right? Like, so let's say you might need the teachers to testify, or a doctor to testify, or a therapist. Well, at that point, if the kids have been a couple of years in Texas, that's probably where those people are that have relevant recent knowledge. Let's say there's a dispute with the child and having ADHD and needing medication, and one parent thinks that's a good idea, another doesn't, a common dispute. And well, now if in that case the doctor who's been and the therapist who've been dealing with that child and the teachers who've been teaching that child are all in Texas, and anything from Colorado, those are people that haven't seen the kid in 2 or 3 years, haven't taught, the older teachers from, prior grades. So it just makes sense in the judge's mind, like, let's do this case where it's easy to get a hold of those people, where it's easy for them to travel, to come to court, these days. Now, you can now testify by Zoom a lot of times, so maybe that's less of an argument than it used to be. But that was always the cutoff that I've seen, was right at about the 2 year mark, and at that point the judges think, it needs to go to the new place. Less than that, maybe not.
Right. And the argument is what's going to be the most convenient forum, even though Colorado has kind of the original home state. Where is it going to be most convenient, regardless of, whether Melanie lives here in Colorado or not? That's, really the kind of main argument. Well, Brian, let's switch gears. We talked about international, the Child Abduction Prevention Act. It is a uniform, and it kind of talks about from state by state. I don't think judges really are all that concerned when there's a risk of a child going to Florida or Texas. But man, the judge's worst nightmare is a child that goes to Argentina or some other state, and or some other country, and doesn't come back. We had a very well known case here in the Roaring Fork Valley in Colorado of that happening. So, can you walk with listeners through some of the different aspects of international jurisdiction, and some of the issues when a parent flees to a different country?
I mean, the key question ultimately, I think, is the country that the parent has fled to with the child going to cooperate to get the child back and make that parent follow the rules. Obviously, as we talked about, the 50 states in the United States have to follow each other's rules. But there's not an equivalent power out there in the rest of the world. So, what I've seen, so you do have a law. It's called the Hague Convention. We call it the Hague Convention for short, and it essentially says, if someone has fled with the child against a court order of one of these other countries, all the countries that have signed this will return the child to that home country. It doesn't determine who gets custody. It just says we're going to make sure this child is not held hostage, basically, or kidnapped elsewhere. So there's that, but there's two problems. One is that not every country, in fact, many countries have not signed that, and so don't follow it necessarily. And then secondly, there's an issue, which is some of the ones that have signed it don't have very good functioning legal systems. And I guess even beyond that, there's a third issue, which is that even if they do have good legal systems, and even if they do have signed this, they may not. It's still really expensive to fight these things. You're going to have to fight. Let's say Germany, for example, the mom's taking the child to Germany. Well, that's a country that signed the Hague Convention and with the functioning legal system. But you're going to have to hire a lawyer in Texas or in the United States, and then you're going to have to hire a lawyer in Germany. And these things are expensive, and these are complex cases. And so it's pretty rare when it happens, but again, it's devastating, right? I mean, you don't get to see your kid again if they've been taken to another country. So it's a real problem, and it's a complex issue. And then of course, there's some gray areas, right? There's countries that have semi-functioning legal systems, that kind of work, and those might not be great, but they're better than nothing. And then of course, there are countries that aren't Hague signatories that you might still be able to get a court order to send the child back, but they haven't signed the Hague Convention, so you're going to have to go about it a different way within that country. So.
Yeah, in Colorado, we just recently had a appellate case that provided some guidance, because there is the Uniform Child Abduction Prevention Act. I referenced that earlier, but the language, it says, the statute says that you need to have a quote credible risk. And so in the recent case in 2023, and it was intermarriage of, and the last name is a mouthful, but it's like Badawai. But the situation in that, Brian, that I think you can certainly relate to, and especially based in Houston, that just such an international hub. But in the situation in the case in Colorado, the father was from Jordan, or had a Jordanian passport, and so he would often go to Jordan. He would go to Dubai Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. And the issue is he going to go there with the children and then not come back? And, Brian, I'm sure you see a lot of times people, if they want to go to spring break, we're just in recording this kind of fishing up spring break for many people. And if they want to go to Costa Rica or Mexico or Jordan, most of the airlines are going to require some sort of notarized authorization form that says that the other parent is aware of them traveling internationally. And the reason is that the airlines, they don't want to, be held responsible, but they also want to make sure that if divorced, people are traveling, that they're not abducting the children. And so there needs to be consent. We've kind of seen stories in the news and hear about, the mom gets upset and she just runs away and goes kind of covert in Switzerland or Argentina, and they take on different aliases and names. And I mean, they're just horrific stories that, as a parent could, really, result in some lost sleep. And so, but the issue is, even though we've heard these horrible stories, just because someone has an international passport, does that mean that they're going to not come back? And so in the case in Colorado, the court said you have to post, father, a $50,000 bond when you travel with the children and give up your passports when you're not traveling. And so there's various things that the courts can do if there is a credible risk, but it's to your point in terms of that Hague Convention, which is a factor of where are they traveling to. And I think the courts are going to get into, have there been previous threats of, I'm going to go to so and such place and not come back? Have they quit their job or sold their house? Are there these activities that would result or that would be consistent with abducting, someone? And I mean, they really are challenging cases, as you said. But any kind of experience that you have, Brian, that you think listeners might find helpful if they kind of are dealing with some of the international abduction risks?
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, first of all, the only time I've ever represented somebody who's had their child taken away to another country and kind of disappeared with the child was out of the blue that my client, the dad, the husband, didn't see coming. They're both from Bolivia, both professionals who had worked really hard to immigrate to this country and get their citizenship and start their careers over. And their marriage had fallen apart. It happens, right? And they had a young child, and it just seemed, they both had, fine financial support here, et cetera. And just one day, my client went over during the middle of the divorce to get his kid for the weekend, and she wasn't there. He didn't think that much of it. He texted her. She didn't respond. And eventually, it turns out she just got on a plane that Friday and flew to Bolivia. And again, they don't have a functioning legal system down there. And so, I mean, they have a functioning legal system, but it's highly corrupt. Let me put it that way. And so, he never said to me like, "Hey, I'm concerned she might run away with the child." Quite the opposite. So, it was so. If you have any doubts or even the slightest concern, you should really take efforts to it. Number two case was a case I picked up where the mom had allegedly, let me say that since we're lawyers here, fled with the child first to Italy, then to Turkey, then to Greece. And basically the dad here in the U.S., and they were both immigrants also, but again, highly successful folks that had seemingly had no reason to return to any of these places. He was playing whack-a-mole overseas with, he'd get an order from Italy and she went to Turkey. Then years later, he'd get an order from Turkey saying, give the kids back, and then she went to Greece. And it was really a problem. And despite having the law on his side and kind of unlimited resources, it had been a really long time since he had seen his kid, years and years. And I'm not sure, I'm not in that case anymore, but I'm not sure he's ever going to see his children. And it's, and that's what, Italy's, an EU member, a NATO member, maybe not the greatest legal system in all of Europe, but it's still a functioning system. And so that's worrisome. And lastly, I just finished a trial 2 weeks ago where my client, an American citizen, was marrying a gentleman, a British citizen who happened to live in Dubai, speaking of that, who was actually half Jordanian, but he's living in Dubai for another couple of years. And the dad lived in Connecticut. It's a long, complicated story. But anyway, she wanted to move over there to get married. And then in 3 years, they were going to move back to the States, most likely. And the dad was just beside himself. Like, what if she stays over there, Dubai, or see what UAE actually is not a signatory to the Hague Convention? And my client's like, I'm an American. My husband's British. We're not going to stay in Dubai. It's a nice place, but not. There's no plans to do that. And you can see the kid all summer, Christmas time, whatever. And the judge really thought about it. I mean, ultimately, the judge let her go, but that was one of their big issues was, well, Dubai isn't a signatory to the Hague Convention, and for some reason she decides to stay over there and deny him visitation. He doesn't have much he can do about it, and I mean, there are two sides of the story, right? I mean, it's not as simple as that, and of course, there's low trust between the parents, which is why that's how people get into this litigation anyway. Is generally that's a characteristic of it. So it's really complicated. It's all over the place, and it's terrifyingly high stakes. Totally understand it.
Yeah, from my perspective, there's two different aspects where the international comes into play. The first is that if there's a divorce between two people, Eric and Melanie, and there's some sort of international connection where Melanie might be British or she could have been raised in Hong Kong. I've seen that before. Then Eric is going to really want to make sure that preemptively, he's going to try to obtain some, safeguards that are at play. And, whether you go to trial, but, really want to talk with his attorney, you or me, about what can I do? How serious is this risk? There are the situations like you went through in terms of, just that they could come home and they could be completely gone. There was a case here in the Roaring Fork Valley where, the mom wanted to relocate to Argentina, and she got the evaluation from the custody evaluator that was not in her favor, and in response she got scared and just put the kids on a plane and went to Argentina and didn't come back. But there's that situation. But then there's also the situation where one actually that a child is abducted or is there is some sort of modification or that the children are actually in the destination, the other country. And in that situation, as you said, it gets really complicated because you are dealing with, international lawyers. I've had cases in Hong Kong, France, England. I lived for a year in England at a boarding school after college, and that we would have parents from Russia, from children from Russia, from Mali, from all different countries. And so you can see how this plays out, and it gets incredibly complicated. And there are attorneys that specialize in just the international component that work with local counsel like you and me, because there's so many moving pieces. But I mean, the general idea is supposed to be under the Hague Convention of what we were just discussing, that there should be just one forum, there should be enforcement, but it does not actually in practice happen as easily as Texas versus Colorado, and even that is fairly complicated. So, Brian, I think it's one of those things that if that situation happens, people they need to figure out a way to find someone that has some experience, because as I've gone through it and as you've gone through it, it is incredibly complex, and there are no easy answers, and the stakes are just so high. It's not just calling the police and saying someone kidnapped my child, which a lot of people kind of think that that's what you do. But there's no remedy that's really easy if a child is in another country.
Yeah, 100% agree. And nothing's more serious, or it can't be higher stakes than that. That's for sure.
Well, Brian, thank you for the time. Hope
Sure.
you do well at the slot machines or whatever your game of choice is
I'm
in
here
Las
for
Vegas.
I'm here on business, I promise. So I actually am. So
Uh, well, appreciate the time, and we'll have links to the show notes in the show notes to your firm and to your podcast. What's the best way for people to reach out to you if they're interested in finding out more about your guys' firm?
yeah, our website, there's chat, email, call, whatever. We have a dedicated intake team and happy to help people. That's what we do.
Well, thanks again for joining us, Brian. And if you have found this episode helpful or relevant, please subscribe and leave us a review. And if you have any feedback, please leave us a comment in the relevant show notes or podcast recording, and or feel free to shoot us a message. But until next time, thanks for joining us on Divorce at Altitude. This is Ryan Calamea.